Cool. Hi, everyone. Larry, do you want to kick it off?
I was going to let Barra do that.
Sure. Hey, hello everyone. Thank you for joining our third virtual meetup of BC Flutter. And today we have with us Nick Manning. So Nick Manning, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself to the team and just get right into it.
Hey, everyone. Yeah, I'm Nick. Thanks for having me at this meetup. I'm honored to speak. I will be winging it because I created this deck an hour ago and I've never practiced this, but I have a YouTube channel and a site, fluttercrashcourse.com, and I will be kind of doing a mini course on this topic later, probably September, October. Stay tuned for that. I'll share the links in a minute. So even though this presentation might not be perfect, might be a little too casual for you, not as concise, it's gonna, gonna have some blog posts and video, kind of boiled down videos on this, so not to worry.
Cool.
Yeah.
Sounds good. So today our discussion is going to be around OAuth, OAuth 2, I guess, the best practices, implementation. You're going to share some code, and mostly around just, giving us a little bit of a taste of what it would be like as a full stack Flutter developer.
Yeah. Right. So can you see my screen okay?
Yes.
I'm sharing a portion of my screen, so I'm not doing full screen mode. Sorry about that. You can see the slides here. Not as nice looking, but this presentation is about OAuth and the context of full stack Flutter. Full stack Flutter is, it's not really accurate to say full stack Flutter. It's really full stack Dart, right? When I say full stack Flutter, what I mean is, it's basically a skill for Flutter developers that covers backend and front end. So the front end being Flutter, backend is Dart, writing Dart services. So if I'm a full stack Flutter developer, I'm writing full stack code, like I'm managing a database, I'm storing data to a database somewhere in the cloud. I'm writing backend services like an web service API, and I'm using Dart for that. And I think it's a very capable language and ecosystem for doing that. And on the front end, I'm using Flutter. So that's also Dart. There's lots of benefits to that, and that's another topic, another discussion, but basically you get a lot of code sharing. You don't have to do a lot of context switching. It's just easier and simpler for kind of like projects, and there's less technologies to learn. And for especially smaller companies or even big ones, it's less kind of like hiring overhead. You just hire for people who know Dart and Flutter and you're good. So that's it. I will be creating videos on my YouTube channel. You can see the link down there, youtube.com. You could see my full link there. And this will be kind of like videos all over the place with full stack Flutter. But the channel is called Nick Manning, so I'll be covering other technical topics beyond Dart and Flutter anyway, so that's going to get really interesting. And that's my personal website, my Twitter handle, and my site, fluttercrashcourse.com, where I have Flutter videos. So let's continue. So a bit about me. I'm a senior engineering manager at Capital One. Been there for about a year and a half. Been writing software for 20 years. Yes, I look young, but I am 38 years old. So you could do the math there. I say that because the amount of people that comment on my videos, they're like, what? I am the founder of fluttercrashcourse.com, and formerly did a startup going through Techstars, director of mobile for a TripAdvisor acquired company called City Maps, co-founder of the social mobile app, Somolo app called Swig, tech lead at larger e-commerce projects like Reebok.com, Adidas.com, and CTO at various startups, and that's my LinkedIn URL. So I like coding, and yeah, that's my background. So today what we'll cover is OAuth. What it is, what you need to know, what you don't need to know. Why do I want to use OAuth if I'm a mobile app developer, right? Today we're going to be covering native mobile apps. So it could be iOS, Android, Flutter. And I won't be covering SPA apps or web apps right now, client-side JavaScript apps. And I'm going to do an end-to-end Flutter Dart demo of kind of an OAuth flow in action. It's going to be very rudimentary, but it's going to give folks an overview on kind of the code that's used to create a web service API in Dart with a database backing it, how to use the kind of well-known Aqueduct framework, which is allows people to kind of work with a database and offer up HTTP endpoints, and also Flutter, so a simple app that will just serve up an OAuth page and kind of sign the user in for a session. Very rudimentary. So let's talk about the OAuth stuff now. So here's the thing. There's a ton of articles online about OAuth, and it's been around for a while. Everyone knows that OAuth is, hey, I want to sign up for a site. Instead of entering my email, I could just click, authenticate with Facebook or authenticate with Google or github.com, right? And those third-party sites say, all right, well, we already know who you are, right? Like if I want to sign up for, let's say, like GitLab, right? If I want to sign up for GitLab, I don't want to enter my email. Maybe I already have a GitHub account. I'm going to click the sign up with github.com, right? And it's going to open up it's going to redirect me to another web page. If I'm on a native mobile app, it's going to open a web browser and take me to github.com. And it's going to say, if you're signed into github.com, it's, it's going to say, can we give this other app your information? Can we let it access information on your behalf, such as like your contact list or your GitHub repos or your email, et cetera, or your avatar picture? If you say yes, it'll redirect back to the app. If it doesn't know, if you're not signed into github.com, it will say, okay, enter your username and password. It'll authenticate you, and then it will do the same thing. It'll pivot back to your app. The benefit there is that, your app, or let's say you're on gitlab.com. I'll show a demo of GitLab right now. And so you can see, this is gitlab.com, and I want to sign in. I have that, you click on, let's say, the GitHub link, and it'll do that same flow. Although that failed because I'm already signed up with another provider, so I won't click into that. But it'll pivot back to the app, and it doesn't. The whole point is you're not giving GitLab.com your email and password. You're letting GitHub do it for you, and that's convenient, and it's quite secure. So that's the gist of OAuth, right? But here's the thing. OAuth isn't only useful to give apps access to your data without needing to kind of collect your password. You can also use it for your first-party applications. So if I'm writing an app, I can still use OAuth, and that's what I'm going to cover today. Like if I have a new Flutter app or an iOS app or an Android app, and I have a web service API, right? I don't have to use OAuth just because I want to provide other services my data. I can also use it for just authorization. So that's just the high level. And let me get back into some terminology. But on the high level talking points is it's an open standard. It's recognized open standard that a lot of people use. And based on my kind of example is that it provides client apps with a secure, scoped delegate access. You're delegating access to your app, that service is delegating access to your app, and it's scoped because it's only giving the data that it needs, right? It's not giving them all the data it needs. And it avoids the need for that app to collect a password directly. Lastly, it decouples the concept of authentication versus authorization. So let me go into these kind of terms that you see with OAuth, right? So first off, authentication confirms your identity, right? That's not what we're going to cover today, right? A lot of you, if you do research on OAuth, you'll see like ODIC, OpenID Connect. That's a layer on top of OAuth, but that's not covered here. That authentication is like, hey, give me my profile of my app based on my ID. That's kind of your, it's letting you fetch data about yourself. And the authentication part is basically vetting that you are who you say you are. But authorization is what we're going to cover today, and that's kind of the OAuth part. Authorization is verifying if someone has access to something, right? Are you authorized to access, GitHub.com, right? The four main concepts in OAuth are auth server, resource owner, and client application. These are just fancy terms for basic stuff, but it's important to understand what they are because when you read about like different flows, UML diagrams, you'll recognize this stuff and know what folks are talking about. So auth server is a backend service, for example, that is basically managing and distributing access tokens for you. The resource server is the actual service that kind of like that is storing the data that you want to access. Typically, the auth server and the resource server are the same thing, and that's what I'm going to demo today. They're going to be the same API. Resources is like user data, but that API layer that I'm going to show you is also the auth server. So they're typically the same thing, not like in this diagram. There's a resource owner, so that's the actual person that owns the data that wants to access it, right? That's a fancy way of saying that it's the end user. And lastly, the client application. That's the actual app that's asking on your behalf, hey, can I kind of call out to, let's say, github.com and let it authenticate you? And is that okay? So those are high-level terms. So I'm going to show you kind of something like GitHub Auth on a mobile app, right? Here's the thing. I'm going to open my mobile device. So I have going to allow it, and hold on for a sec. I wanted to show you how github.com on Android, I have an Android phone here, does authentication, like sign up and sign in. So you see my Android device here. This is a native app, okay? But you'll notice that it's very simple, and this is probably a web view. And this is like a best practice in the OAuth world to use a web view for native apps. And in the next slide, I'm going to go into why you want to use a web view for a native app. But this is like the kind of GitHub sign-in. So I'm on the native app. I click sign in, and it goes through the flow that I explained. This is another like web view, right? If I'm already signed in to GitHub, it's just going to say, hey, can we access your data? If you say yes, it'll pivot back to the app and sign you in. If you're not signed into GitHub already, you just enter your information. I'm not going to do it right now, but you enter your password, and you can see part of that password, but not all of it. So I'm not going to type the rest. But you sign in with your password, and then it will say, can I access can the app access your email and your list of repos? And it'll pivot back to the app. So I'm not going to do that now because it asks for multi-factor authentication and all of that, but that's the gist of it. It'll sign in and show the screen. So that's the demo today that I'll show you. I've implemented this using Dart, this exact kind of flow, right? So I hope that gives you a good idea. And heck, let's try this on gitlab.com, right? So this is the GitLab's website, right? If I want to sign in or sign up, let's say I want to sign in, instead of entering my email, I'm going to click GitHub. And here, let me clear my cookies because it knows that I've signed up with GitLab via email already. So it's going to say, sorry, don't sign up with GitHub, because you've already signed up with email. So don't do that. So let's see if we can, I cleared my cookies. And let's see, 1 second. Clear my cookies, go back to the sign-in page. Crunch, crunch, crunch. And I'm on github.com. I'm going to sign out of GitHub. I'm going to clear my cookies here too. And let's see, I'm going to click GitHub. Now, here's the point. On native, it's the same flow. On web, it's the same flow. I hit authenticate with github.com and it presents me with this page. This page is, as you notice, hosted by github.com. It's not hosted by GitLab. GitLab doesn't need to take responsibility for kind of passing on my username and password. It doesn't need to take responsibility for collecting my username or password, right? So I'm going to type in, my username and whatever password. I can type it in here without people seeing it. So I'm going to type in the whole thing. I'm going to do multi-factor authentication. This is another benefit of using a web page to do this because it allows us to easily use multi-factor authentication, which is like verifying my SMS. So I'm going to say verify. Now, I get an error here because GitLab is saying, hey, you already signed up with email, so you can't sign up with GitHub. So I'm just going to go back to the home page. But if it did work, it would go back to here and it would sign me into a to my account. So that's the general gist of OAuth and what it's used for. And let's continue. So we demoed this on the web and mobile, right? So for native apps, right? Like why shouldn't I just kind of have a a username and password? If I have like my app, like nickmanning.dev app, right? Why can't I just collect the username and password? Well, there's a few reasons, right? If you click on OAuth 2 for native apps, there's an RFC, right? Request for comments. This is a very good document. It doesn't look great because it's all in Courier New here, but it's a very concise kind of explanation on why you want to kind of use OAuth as a standard for authorization, right? I won't go into this now, but I recommend reading it and kind of understanding it, right? And basically what it says, and some other what people say, is that using OAuth is a standard way to kind of implement authorization. It's a recognized standard, and it doesn't make you think about how to actually do authorization. Second is because, let's say you're using a Webview on your native mobile app, and I'll get to that in a little bit. Why? There's multiple benefits of that, right? Because OAuth, when you're kind of going through an OAuth flow with an OAuth service, that flow, when you enter your username and password, is hosted with a trusted web app at a trusted domain. If you're doing this via a native app and it pivots and opens up a Webview, it's going to serve up the same exact page as if you were on the website, right? So by doing this, it reduces the attack surface, right? Versus kind of entering in natively your username and password. using a web page to kind of like log in is with the auth server itself, and avoids a lot of kind of attack vectors, right? Especially phishing attacks, right? So phishing attack could be someone develops an app that looks exactly like your app, and they kind of make a fake login page, and they kind of install it on their device. They don't, submit it to the app store, and they just install it on their device and kind of hand you their phone and say, hey, can you log in with your account for me? That's an example of a phishing attack, right? So that's possible. But if you were like, it's really hard to they could see that they're on your, the only way that authentication would work is if it pivoted to a web view that hosted the authorization part, the OAuth part. It's a lot harder to kind of like get your password there because it's hosted by a trusted web page. It also allows us to offer up multi-factor authentication. So because it's hosted on a web page, you can use MFA quite easily. And you can still have a good UX by maintaining a native looking kind of like page, right? The authentication page can look like, your app, right? It doesn't have to look like a web page. And really another big value add is that users can use their existing password manager. Password managers usually they integrate with the web, so it's going to detect that you're entering your username, and it's going to say, hey, do you want me to kind of like paste in the password for you? You can't really do that on native apps. And lastly, you get kind of like single sign-on for free. So if you want to kind of offer up this authorization page to other apps in the future, you can do that. And if you have multiple services, like you have nickmanning.com, and then you have like videoplayer.nickmanning.com, or if you have kind of like another ancillary service like the nickmanning.com native app, and then you have another native app that kind of authenticates with the same backend service. You can kind of host that single page, and you implement it once, right? You can, and then each one of those services, those products, it could be a web page or a native app, only has to authenticate once. That's it. You don't have to re-sign it again, right? So before I demo, I want to make a point that there's a lot of different types of OAuth flows, and when you read online, there's different, what to use and what not to use. What I recommend doing is ignoring the kind of like only focusing on one flow that's recommended for native apps, which is the Auth code flow. Now, I didn't create a slide on Auth code flow that we'll demo today because it's just too complex. I will explain it as we go, but it's basically what I described. You're entering your credentials on a web page, and you're getting a token back, and that's it. Like the app can use the token and all that. In terms of all the other pieces of information the app gets to kind of proceed with OAuth, I don't need to go into that because it's a part of another talk. Today, I want to just focus on the general gist of OAuth. If you see other types of OAuth flows online out there, and you're curious as what's the best one to use, FYI, there's Implicit Flow, which is a very standard practice, a very standard flow, but it's considered insecure. So if you read an article that was written like 4 or 5 years ago, you might think it's fine. If you read an article about it that's written like a year ago, it's not that secure, and they're going to probably recommend another type of flow, which is the Auth code plus Pixie code flow, which I won't get into what Pixie is. Other things are password grant flow. There's client credentials flow. There's different types of flows in OAuth, and basically the one that we're going to cover today is the app the auth code flow. Anyway, so I hope you get a gist of that. And yeah.
And that's Nick, that's the most commonly practiced right now, right? Or is it?
Yeah. The
It's the code grant. It's called the code grant flow. Is that the same thing?
Auth code. Yeah, auth code grant. Right.
Yeah. Okay.
The kind of old school way to do it. This is how Twitter did it many, many, many years back, which is extremely insecure. Is that if you go to like open the Twitter app a long time ago, like really long ago, the web app, for example, and you want to authenticate with, let's say, Google, it's going to personally take your username and password, and you're trusting Twitter to hold your username and password in memory, transmit it through the web to Google and authenticate with Google, and Google's going to give you back an access token. And you're trusting Twitter for that. Like maybe the developer can like mistakenly take that password and log it, write it down somewhere, whatever. So that's very insecure. And that's kind of the resource owner password credentials grant type. And I put a link there as to why it's not a great flow, but it's easier to implement. Any other questions? Okay.
We'll get to the QA at the very end. I just wanted to
just
interject a quick question. Yeah.
Now, while I'm yammering on about like OAuth in the demo, which is going to be probably 20 minutes, we're a half hour in, there's a code here that's public that, you can go to scenic code /full-stack Flutter. This repo will contain examples, and it's going to contain an OAuth example. It's going to have a client and a server, servers in Dart, clients with Dart, also Flutter. Okay. If you go to the server and go to the README, you'll get detailed instructions on how to run through this yourself. And that's what we're going to do today. We're going to do most of this today. I'm going to like bypass the nitty-gritty stuff here. Let me magnify it. Okay. And then same for the client. You need Flutter installed and all that. So yeah, let's continue. So that's what we're going to do. Server, Dart, Aqueduct, client, Flutter, and the source code for it. So let me disconnect my phone, and I'm going to start an emulator. I use the Genymotion emulator because it's less resource intensive, and I just like it better. I'm going to start up Samsung Galaxy phone. And let me just show you it working first, and then I'll show you the code so you kind of understand it okay. You can use the Android Studio emulator as well if you like. And if you're on Mac, you obviously use kind of the iOS simulator. This demo works on Windows and Mac, so you just have to read the README carefully because the Genymotion emulator uses a different IP address if you want to access localhost. And the reason why we have to access localhost is because we're going to run a Dart server on our computer. So let's do that. Let me close these windows. All right, let's make sure. So this is my README. Let's make sure the server started. So I have my Aqueduct server started, and Aqueduct is, let me close all these windows. I don't want to confuse people. So Aqueduct is a Dart-based web service framework, and it, what I said in the past is like in the first part of the presentation is it gives you the ability to easily write web service APIs, and it gives you an ORM, object relational mapper, and that lets you work with databases very easily. So it lets you store data there if you want to save data. And that's the crux of it. That's the basics of what it offers, right? Aqueduct also is, I'll open the GitHub repo, GitHub Aqueduct. Also, it gives you OAuth, and OAuth is baked into Aqueduct, right? So that's what I'm going to be using. Aqueduct offers all the major OAuth flows like implicit, client credentials, password, resource owner, auth code. But it doesn't yet offer the more secure auth code plus Pixie yet, but you don't need to be concerned about that right now. I'm not going to set up Aqueduct in this video. I'm going to just give you the gist of what you need to do. Is you need to install a database like Postgres. If you go to my YouTube channel, I'm going to create some videos on kind of like Aqueduct and doing all this. So you could subscribe to that. It's just youtube.com/c/nickmanning.dev. So don't worry if you don't want to follow along now. It's not meant to be, it's not meant to have folks follow along. You install Dart. You activate Aqueduct. It's a public, kind of like a pub Dart package. So when I do pub global activate Aqueduct, that means that I'm kind of getting the Aqueduct Dart package, but I can use it from the command line. And then I could just use Aqueduct as a command. I can say Aqueduct create my project. Now, the project that I did create is called OAuth. I'll show you the source code. Let me zoom in here. There's a lib directory, a bin directory. Now, I have a templates directory that I created because it's going to render my authentication page where I collect username and password. It's just an example demo page. It's not perfect. And I'll just show you what that actually does. And let me just do the demo first. So I'm going to open now my Flutter project. So this Flutter project, let's see if I could start it. It should know that I have a simulator running. And let me just walk through it actually working. So it's running assemble debug right now. It's syncing. Cool. So let me know if anyone can't see this, but this is my really ugly material design app. And it's gonna be like the front door of your app, right? So let's say I just downloaded the app and I want to log in, and I have a OAuth, an auth server called nickmanning.dev. It's hosted on nickmanning.dev. It's not really, but it's just an example. On nickmanning.dev, I have a service that is my OAuth service. So rather than collect the username and password here, I can offer users to be logging in via nickmanning.dev instead of collecting it in the native app. So I have my Aqueduct service running. So let's see if this works. Cool. So I'm at my really ugly, basic username and password, like OAuth authorization page. It's going to collect a username and password, and it's going to kind of see if that's correct, the username and password's correct. It's then going to, if it is correct, it's going to pivot back to the app, and it's going to give the app a special token called an access token. And that's it. I'm just going to show you in the app that the access token was fetched, and then I can make as many web service calls as I want using that access token, right? I already have a user signed up. Let me check who that was. It was basically, yeah, Bob38. Really.
Quick question.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Go ahead.
So you have Aqueduct running locally, correct?
I have Aqueduct running on localhost. Yeah.
Close. Right now, this is hitting that Aqueduct server, your service, and that's running in
Correct.
Aqueduct.
Correct. Right.
Cool. So we should be able to, like, someone will be able to follow the instructions on GitHub, download, run Aqueduct locally, and then possibly even put breakpoints to see how the flow is working. And,
yeah. Right. Exactly. Now, here's the thing. Before I continue, let me geek out for a sec. To debug external libraries in Aqueduct, you have to have if you're using VS Code, you have to have these two options enabled. Can you guys see that? Debug external libraries, debug SDK libraries. So that's a gotcha. Okay.
That's not in the notes, is it?
It is in the README of the, I think it's in kind of best, like kind of like, let's see, Dart dot. Yeah, it is in here, VS Code settings. I have it under a section called VS Code settings in the README. Sorry, it looks ugly here. So I try to take care of people here.
Cool.
So cool. And before this, I signed up with a user Bob38. And how I did that was I did curl post, and I had a register endpoint called register. And I have a username and password. I submit Bob38 and password. So this is like, this demo is assuming that user already exists. Okay. I'm going to submit the page. Let's see if this works.
So typically we're hitting a database, right?
Yeah, so this is, I'm Bob38 is in my database. Let me show you let me do a newbie way of showing you the database, which is using pgadmin. It's hard to magnify this, but Aqueduct gives me it manages schema for me. Like there's a lot of cool stuff that just, I'm going to kind of dive into this with other videos and stuff like that. It's so cool. Like you basically create a user table called, this is a user table. This is the user model, right? And because it's a managed object, it has a lot of common like attributes to it, and it has an email and other fields. And if I run a special Aqueduct command, it's going to know that those fields don't exist yet in the database. It's going to create a migration file, which is a Dart file, and it's going to generate the fields that I don't have. How insanely cool is that?
That's really, really cool, actually.
I mean, I'm glad you share the excitement, and I'm not just yammering on alone here.
This is like grunt work, boring stuff that you got to take care of, and someone is doing it for you.
It's the stuff like the very most awesomest frameworks out there already do, like Ruby on Rails, Elixir, Phoenix, that's using Elixir. I don't know. There's a lot of other ORMs that do the code generation stuff, right? So it'll create a migration file for you, and then you basically type in Aqueduct upgrade, I think. I don't have it in my command history, but you do Aqueduct upgrade, and it'll kind of like create the database schema. So I have a user table, and it'll have, these are the columns: email, ID, username, hash, password, blah, blah, blah. The other thing I do is this. I have to create, like, there has to be something called a client ID, because I have to, like, the client that's accessing it is my app. Like, I can't just let anyone access my OAuth service, right? So there's a special command called Aqueduct Auth add client. And I give it an ID. I call it something generic like dev.nickmanning, right? That way I know that client ID has this secret 1234, and that the redirect URI is going to be, it's not going to be google.com. It's going to be the IP address, any URL I want. The reason why it's this URL is because my app is expecting like to receive that. Now, because I'm using a native app, that URL will probably use a URL scheme where it'll be like foobar : / like my cool app : / whatever, OAuth receiver, redirect, whatever. And then it'll like pivot back to the app automatically. So I'll go into the code with the Flutter app that basically when you submit your form, the server is going to redirect back to this URL. And then the Flutter app is going to just check like, oh, I'm getting redirected back. Let me take the access, the code that it's giving me and exchange it for an access token. Now, I'm using all these different terms like code, access token, all this stuff. Like, don't worry about it. You'll see diagrams on this later, but I just wanted to show the high level flow. And like the reason why I'm not showing it, because it's a little convoluted, but
just a fun fact, that's why it's called code grant flow. because of that code exchange.
Yes, it's exchanging a code for
Auth.
an access token, right?
Yeah, exactly. Auth token.
Cool. So the demo worked. Like I have an access token, and now I have a refresh token. And here's what's cool. Now if I go down my README, I can try all this out using curl. I don't have to use a Flutter app. That web page, if I successfully authenticate, it's going to redirect me back to that redirect URL, and it's going to give me a code, an auth code in the query string, right? I'm going to take that special code in the query string. My Flutter app is going to do a post, HTTP post, and it's going to exchange that code for an access token. It's going to have the client ID and secret base64 encoded in the auth header. And it's going to say, hey, I want a code. I have a code here. So I say response type code. Here's my client ID. You can forget state for now. That's something else that gives you more security. And oh, I'm sorry. This is what the hosted web page that the mobile app serves up is submitting to the server. This is the actual web page that's submitting this, right? So let's look at that page in Aqueduct. Let me open it again. This is what the page looks like, right? So let me open the code for the server, okay? So in an Aqueduct app, and I'm going to be very concise about this because I know we probably only have like 10 minutes left. I think it's an hour. So I'll be very, very concise. But basically, Aqueduct gives you this file called channel. It lets you establish channels. And those are basically mapping and HTTP routes to actual functions. So register, you go to the register controller. Auth code, I can submit my auth code there, and it's going to use the Aqueduct's auth redirect controller. I don't have to write any code for this. And then when I get that code, it's going to I can exchange it for a token using this endpoint. Again, I don't have to write any code here. And this is the page it serves up. It's a mustache template, username, password, response type code, client ID, blah, blah, blah. Yeah, that's the gist of it. Let me go back. Here, this is the important stuff, right? I have a special route called protected. It is an example route that's protected. Like you need to be signed in. You need to have an access token to access this route. So I can add this as middleware to my in Aqueduct and say, here's my auth server, and you need a bearer token to access this. So once I have my access token here, let me have to sign in again, Bob38 and password, submit. I think it was Bob38. You get an access token and a fresh token. And then I can use that access token for actually accessing the protected endpoint here. So I can do curl get /protected, and I can include that exact bearer token. That's my access token.
So what's the duration of the access token? Like when does the refresh token kick in?
I forgot the Aqueduct's default, but it's a certain time frame. If that bearer token expires, the client side code in the Flutter app, which you're going to probably be using a prepackaged OAuth client library. I wrote it myself just for the example to not convolute things, but it's going to use this refresh token that's going to be securely stored on the device using a secure method, because native apps can securely store secrets. It's not a SPA app. And you're going to call this auth token endpoint, and you're going to say grant type, hey, I have a refresh token, pass it the refresh token, and it's going to give you a fresh access token. So that way you don't have to sign in again.
Is there a recommended best practice on the duration?
I don't know what duration is best practice, but it's best practice. It's you're going to have an expiration date to it, because if it's compromised, if that access token is compromised, like there's only so long that someone could use it.
Yep.
Cool. Now there's other, like the Auth code plus Pixie standard is more secure. Like it adds a little more security there to make sure that like you are who you say you are, but I'm not going to cover that in this video because it's quite, it's more kind of intense of a flow. So that's it. I can access protected resources using the, access token here. So just to finish up, I will kind of go into real quick the code, right? So I already showed this. It's the user model. Then I have controllers. So I have a registration controller in Dart. So I have a function here called create user, and it accepts a post. So anything I post with this controller, it's going to call this function. And it's going to generate a salt, set a password, and it's going to do an insert to the database. I've also implemented a special controller that is in charge of rendering the web page that I need for the authorization part. And you have to kind of implement this yourself because Aqueduct doesn't know how it should render the web page. It's up to you how you want to render the web page. And then you pass Aqueduct this renderer. You say, hey, this is my renderer for the page. Lastly, I have a protected controller, and all it is returning is, hey, a key value pair, hey, like something protected, right? What's cool here is I don't have to write any authorization or any authorization code here because it's auto-magically protected by this middleware here, authorizer bearer. It's vetting that I have a bearer token. Excuse the terminology, but there's a lot of OAuth terminology. That's just a bearer token is like the bearer is the user that bears the token. So that's it. I don't have any tests. I didn't have time to write tests for this, but let me go over the Flutter code real quick. In my Flutter app, I have a very simple app, right? It's a material app. I have a login page, which represents the front door here with a button. And this login page has state to it because that state, I'm going to update this label here when I get the token. And I have a button, and I'm going to present a new page. So I'm going to say navigator push. And when the page is dismissed, I'm awaiting the page, right? When the page is opened and I, get the results back, I'm getting a token back from that page. So that's how I implement this here. And then I'm doing set state, right? Cool. And then this is the OAuth page. Now, there's OAuth client libraries that exist already. I tried them out. They're not amazing. They take a little work to kind of implement, and I wasn't sure how easy it would be with a custom like auth server. Like they work with Google and Twitter, Facebook, and I know Firebase does it with Google, Twitter, Facebook, and all that stuff. But I just wrote my own because it's very simple, like the basics of it. I don't know what you should do yourself, but heck, this is the example. So I'm using a library called Flutter Webview plugin, and it lets me cite a URL. Now, here's the thing. The IP address you see here on iOS, because I'm using Genymotion emulator, is going to give you this magic IP address that represents localhost, because I'm running this thing localhost, right? But the emulator is running in a virtual machine. It's a VM, right? It has to know about the server running on your local host. So you have to enter this IP in the code if you're using Mac OS. And on Windows, there's another thing you have to do, which I'll put in the README. You have to kind of get the IP address of your computer, which is pretty easy. So anyway, it displays this Webview scaffold, and it contains that web page. And then here's the thing. My kind of like client ID, that auth token, I specify a redirect URI. So if it's successful, it's going to redirect to this URI, the IP address / redirect, right? And the web view here is going to detect if it starts with this URL, it's going to kind of fetch, it's going to get the code that the auth server passes back, and it's going to fetch an access token using that code. And that's what I showed you with the curl command earlier. I'm posting to this server, and yeah, works. And it's going to get the access token back and the refresh token back. And then what's going to do is after it gets the token back, I'm going to say navigator pop, and it's going to pop this view off the stack, and it's going to pass the token back to the previous page, which is login, and that it has awaited for. And I have a model here called token, and it's just a simple thing to represent a token instead of using a hash. So that's it. Thanks for listening to me yammer on, and it's been a really casual presentation. I'm sorry I didn't go into super detail about the exact auth flow, but I meant to just give you a general taste of OAuth and what it is as a standard. And what I recommend doing is, if you're interested in doing any full stack Flutter, just go to this and subscribe and sign up for the, click the alert button to get notified when I release any videos. It's nickmanning.dev. And you can also see a lot of Flutter tutorials on fluttercrashcourse.com. This is my website, and yeah, you can learn about Flutter there. So thanks for watching. And before we do Q&A, because Capital One is a bit sensitive about their kind of doing Q&As about cybersecurity or any security, like cybersecurity stuff, I'm going to ask that, like, I might have to kind of like not answer any questions related to that, but I can answer questions related to just the demo here and Flutter and Dart and Aqueduct if you like. So thanks for having me.
So while the questions start trickling in, I wanted to ask about your course, Nick. You did mention a little bit. And so what's going to be in the Flutter Crash course? I know it's work in progress from what you told me earlier in the beginning. What are people going to be getting from your course? Is it going to be more, it's going to equip them to become a more full stack developer that can get the Flutter skills, or how is it going to work?
Yeah, so here's the deal. The reason why I'm creating the course is because the reality of Flutter is that there are some enterprises using Flutter, but a lot of small companies use Flutter to really save a lot of money on, hiring Android and iOS developers. Okay. Mm-hmm. They also want to hire as little developers as possible. So rather than hire back-end front-end developers, why not just have one developer write the back-end and the front-end? This can work for smaller apps, but it can also work for larger teams where developers just get bored. They want to contribute to bug fixing a back-end service, and maybe back-end developers want to fix a Flutter thing, a Flutter bug. And it's just from like, I'm an engineering manager, and I know, and I've hired people before at other companies and stuff, and I know that it's best to have as little context switching as possible. And for hiring, it's a lot easier. So the course is geared to folks that want to get into not only like doing pretty things in Flutter, but actually having skills to do consulting and working at companies where, you know, full stack development is an asset. And I think that Dart is a great backend technology, you know, for a lot of use cases. Sometimes it's not a great technology like anything else, but I think it's I think people should take a strong look at it for based on their situation. And I think a lot of Flutter developers out there want to go beyond just Flutter and just writing Flutter apps and relying that a backend service is already available, and also not having to learn a new language to kind of like write backend stuff. So anyway, to answer your question, it's going to be a course geared to people on how to write a basic backend web services, basic concepts of ORM, like object relational mapping, like saving data. It's not going to cover Firestore, Firebase, or anything like that. It's going to be very straightforward because you want to learn skills that are basically reusable skills. Not every company's out there is going to say yes to Firebase. I'm just going to say that.
Right. That's true. Very true. Yeah.
I'm not going to give my opinion about Firebase or Firestore, but it's great for example apps and other certain startups and maybe some dev shops, right? But beyond that, a lot of companies have already a backend services, or they need someone to develop that stuff, and Firebase sometimes may not cut it. So the course is going to cover Flutter as well, on how to kind of do integration testing and just general best practices of writing Flutter apps. So it's going to have people come away from it where they can kind of like go into, let's say, a consulting gig or work at a company and be like high value and never get bored because they can do end-to-end full stack development. But last thing I'll say before I stop my monologue here is doing only front-end development is awesome, and it's very hard. And depending on the project, you probably only want to stick to front-end development. That goes for web, it goes for mobile. It's totally fine to just do front-end development. It's also totally fine, and you probably don't have, like, some companies like want folks to dedicate themselves only to backend development. That's fine too, but it depends on the situation. Other companies like to kind of let people move from backend into front end. Other companies want to use developers for both. It's just a certain type of development, and that's what I'll say. It's not like everybody has to be a full stack engineer. It's just a certain path. That's all. Anyway.
So I have one question about the Aqueduct. Is that, I've heard it before, and now you're talking about it today. It looks pretty impressive, and I saw there was version 4 something. That kind of tells me that it's quite mature framework, just based off of the versioning. My question to you is, do you know if this framework is being used? Is it battle tested? Is it being used out there in real life projects? Aqueduct framework. Yeah,
I forgot, like, let me see if they have I thought they have a page on kind of like what, who uses it. But I forgot, like, I don't know how I've used it for a few years for fluttercrashcourse.com, and it was great. It was a bit resource intensive for the Docker containers. Like, you needed higher memory. Like, I was using Kubernetes, and, you know, it definitely used up more memory than, let's say, Go, of course. Yeah, it's a very polished framework. It has very good documentation. It's maintained by Stable Kernel, which is a dev shop in Georgia. Really smart people. There's a Slack channel, Aqueduct Dart, and there's a lot of helpful people on that Slack channel. It's not the most, like, you know, I don't know what companies, like big companies, use it per se, but I know that it is like a really polished and solid like framework. And it's maintained here and there. It's not like super duper actively worked on, because I think the company that wrote it is kind of preoccupied now with the pandemic and all that stuff. But there's really, I think it's really high quality code, and it reminds me of like Ruby on Rails. It has that level of like, it just works out of the box, and yeah, it's not the end all be all framework, but Dart is in general, I think, awesome, and in general. So
Yeah,
this is just
I
one option
personally,
for people.
I personally find Dart to be a very, I mean, my opinion is that I think it's a very fun language. It's
Well,
fun.
Dart is like, if Dart is like, if like Ruby and C# had a baby. I mean, it's
Right. It doesn't get in
or
your way, you get done what you want to get done. Once you get the hang of it, it's pretty intuitive. It doesn't surprise you. I like it.
yeah,
So,
yeah. It's excellent for Flutter especially, but it's very
right,
easy to use for with Aqueduct and on the back end. So
right.
I'll post some videos on. I have a cool proof of concept on just deploying a Dart service to Google Cloud Run. And it's really easy. You just have a simple Docker file, and you don't need to know about Docker. You just run Docker, and it'll kind of like, you can deploy it to Google Cloud Run and have a hosted service pretty easily.
Nice. Okay,
Yeah.
so some questions here. Feel free to answer or abstain this question from
Sure.
answering this question. It says, hey,
Yeah.
Nick, is Capital One using Flutter now?
Larry can answer that, but the answer is, I don't know. Are we using it, Larry?
It's only being used for internal apps, and it's only a few smaller apps right now, but it's not being used in production apps.
Right. Okay, so any thoughts about building the client side with Flutter Web? How well does Aqueduct work to surface Flutter Web clients? Question mark. Or is it just for web services?
So here's the deal. Aqueduct doesn't come with a thing that renders web pages. You need to use your own, like, you need to write your own code to render web pages, right? So here's an example of how to render a web page. I use a Mustache template here. It's a simple template. Mustache is a templating language. You can inject data into it. And then this is dead simple how to render the page. I fetch the file, and I can put some data into it here, and I render it, and I pass it as a string back to the client. That's standard bread and butter web app stuff. And I use Dart.io and Mustache, the package, and that's it. For Flutter Web, Flutter Web acts like a native client. It would be a different project. You wouldn't like integrate it with it. There wouldn't be any kind of integration with Aqueduct. Aqueduct would be running as a web service API, and then you would have another Flutter Web service, another Flutter Web process, if you will, running your Flutter Web app, and it would make web service calls to. It would act like a SPA, like it would act like a client-side JavaScript application where it's making still web service calls to your API.
Yeah. Yep, that's pretty explanatory. That's the answer to that question. So I don't see any more questions. Larry, did you have any questions?
No, I don't think so. Anybody else have any questions?
So is there anything else you wanted to add before we call it a day?
Yeah, I mean, I'll just get you the link to the presentation. I guess that's it. I guess we'll put the video on YouTube, and yeah, keep in touch, and let me know if you guys have any other questions. But I will create more like solid content on this on YouTube and on my site. So just stay tuned, and Yeah, I guess thanks for having me. And it's an ambitious topic. There's a lot to it. And I hope some folks got a little taste of what OAuth is. And thanks for sticking around. That's it.
Well, thank you, Nick. This was a great presentation. Thank you, Larry. Thank you, everyone, for joining. Okay, and until we'll see you next time for our next event.
Yeah,
Thank
thanks,
you,
Nick.
guys.
Appreciate
Thank
it.
you.
Great seeing everybody here again.
Yeah, great. Thank you.
Yeah. Bye, guys.